Chair. Congratulations to you on chairing this prestigious committee, which is very important in this place.
Thank you.
I want to thank everybody on the committee for your time and your patience, your attention, your comments, and your questions. This is what democracy should be about, even where we disagree, that we can talk about things that really matter, but without getting bitter at one another, and this is good. Most of what you've been talking about since this afternoon has been about the soaring cost of gun massacres. You have recognized the fears that many, particularly children and teenagers, share. You heard a little earlier a pediatrician very thoughtfully talk about gun violence as a public health problem, and you heard a chemical engineer talk wisely, I thought, about layers of protection which are needed to prevent chemical spills and things like that. Somehow, you have to create layers of protection. I thought that Senator Miller said it very well when he said that there were no one bill that would solve this problem, but it would probably take many. I have a list of my responses to your bills, but they don't matter. You will deal with the set. I want to say just a word about assault weapons.
Mr. West, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but is your button up? We can hear you, but the television won't pick up you. Thank you. Fine with me. Everyone at home, I'm sure, was sitting on the edge of their seat, so I just wanted to make sure.
So what I want to do is say just a couple words about the assault weapons ban, and then I want to talk about the mental health problem, because that's a real one, and I've had some experience with it. I believe that these red flag bills that you will deal with are a very important part of the problem, and I was glad that you dealt last year with the domestic violence and the ability to take it away. I want to point out that the common element of what's going on in this crisis that we face in this country, what we've witnessed again and again, is the spreading stain of mass murder, is that we have seen often that these are committed by isolated, embittered men, mostly white men. And we need to understand what that's about. The common element has been that the shooter has been willing to give up his life, that he was ready to die. Maybe he wanted to die. He wanted to be killed and commit suicide. But he had studied, in many cases, they have studied the massacres that have gone on before and said to themselves, how can I outdo all those others who have gone before me? That's the phenomenon that you need to address. And that's going to be really tough. Now, I want to just say a few things about this extreme risk order. And I should have handed it to the clerk before I came over. I've got about 4 copies of my testimony, and I want to refer to one part of that bill specifically on page 2, where you have several categories in the section on petition for order. And so you're saying that a petition, or the sponsors are saying that a petition for a extreme risk protection order may be filed by a law enforcement agency, the Attorney General, a family or household member. I want to suggest that you add a 4th. And I would suggest that it be a person with direct knowledge of the risk posed by the respondent. I put that in, I think, in my testimony, and I want to tell you just a brief story that connects that. What I'm thinking about here is teachers, coaches, social workers, therapists, clergy, who will recognize these risks, and if they have to file a petition and go to a judge, it's serious business. Now, I want to tell you a personal story. Before we moved to Rhode Island in 1988, I served for 12 years as a pastor of a church in Connecticut. And I dealt with numbers of situations where people were unable to get the kind of mental health help that they needed for members of their family. And I see people out on the side of the streets shaking down people for money, and some of them are high, and they've gone all through these things because they've fallen through the cracks of the system. They've not gotten the help that might have turned them around at a crucial point, and the further they go, the harder it gets to turn around. In any event, I saw a number of situations that might have been changed by something like the red flag order, or the legislation you have before you, and I want to tell you about just one case. There was a man in our community who used threats and physical violence to dominate his family and control them. The neighbors knew about what he was doing, and some of them spoke to me sometimes. One day, his wife and 3 children appeared at my office, and they were all visibly upset and terrified and describing his threats to them. She described an outburst in which he said he was ready to kill them and to kill himself. And that's the element that appears in so many of these stories. It's that the shooter has given up on himself, and it's usually himself, and almost everybody else. These people were not members of our congregation, but I reached out to a domestic violence program in a neighboring community, made arrangements to get the mother and the 3 children into a domestic violence shelter, and I drove them to a rendezvous where someone met me to take her and the children to this shelter. And so I didn't know where it was. When the husband found out that they were gone, he asked around among the neighbors and said, "Where did they go?" And somebody said, "Well, I must have told them to call Phil West," because that's what so he came at me with that, and he was demanding to know where they were and how they had gotten there. And he shouted that unless I told him where they were, he would burn down the church or burn down my house, and he would come after me with a gun. And I believe he was serious. He quoted things that he had done when he had been in Vietnam that were brutal and violent and criminal. And so he said, "I will do that to you with joy," because he didn't use the word joy. But he was talking about those atrocities. When he left, I called the police, and I said, "What can we do?" And they basically said, "Has he done anything yet?" And I said, "No." And they said, "Well, he'll probably cool off and he'll forget about it." Anybody want to finish the movie? I will tell you very briefly. In time, his wife and children came out, they went home, and the thing quieted down. He didn't try to burn anything down. He didn't shoot at me. But about 6 months or 8 months later, there was an incident where he barricaded himself in the house, shot out the windows, and held off the state police and the local police for a number of hours until he finally fell asleep. And then they came in and they took him, and he wound up going to prison briefly. We moved here to Rhode Island, and we found out after we came here that he had gotten out of prison and he had shot himself to death. I felt, if anything, relieved because he hadn't taken his family with him. But what a sad story that is, that there was no intervention except criminal intervention after he set off a fracas with the state police. That was the problem. So I urge you to go ahead and do this red flag bill. I urge you to recognize that it's not just the red flag, it's also the weapons, because they're so widely available and they can kill so many so quickly and with such ruthless efficiency before anyone can come. We have to cut down on the number of weapons that are in circulation, and we have to find ways to do it, and it's in your hands to do that. That's the challenge. So I think I've said enough. I hope that you will add that one change that I've suggested of other persons who may know directly of the risk, because I would have gone to a judge. And I know others in that community would have gone to a judge, but nothing could be done in that situation. You got to do better in Rhode Island. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Jabour.
I just want to welcome Mr. West back. It's good to have you before the committee. I also like that you come in a re-election year because you say such nice things about the committee. I can quote you during the campaign. So keep coming, Mr. West.
Senator Matz.
Yeah, I just wanted to welcome Phil. I saw him at the senior agenda this morning. He told me he was coming. Good to see you. And Gabe, one thing I forgot to mention to you, some of my best assets getting leads with people that had ideas of violence came from the students who would pull my coat. And so working very closely. And I think if I can share with everybody, the surprising thing for me being the deacon is no one's talking about the spiritual aspect. But I want you to know there was a bunch of us when Senator Lynch Prada and Senator Archambault was here at 3 o'clock in the morning with the advocates for the Second Amendment trying to work out a common sense legislation that we passed last year, taking the guns away from the domestic violence. To me, that was prayer. People put all their emotions aside and said, look, we have to do something. And they got together and they came up with a bill, a compromise bill that both, a good compromise, no one's totally satisfied. But that's what happened. So for me, it's a very spiritual issue because, if my people, which are called by my name, will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I'll hear from heaven, I'll forgive their sin, and I'll heal their land. So this is just as much spiritual as anything as we deal with these issues. Because again, as I said earlier, we have to protect the kids and we have to protect people's rights. And we can get there, but we have to have the right spirit. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator Matz. Senator Archambault.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. West, it's always good to see you. I think it's worth noting in your story, as sad as it is, that at the time there was no remedy available to police officers, but Rhode Island is now the first in the country that has mental health police officer training that's passed and is now taught at the police academy by the state police and local police. And I think it's worth noting. So we're doing something right. And that's really the enabler for red flag once it's tweaked. Can't have red flag if you don't have that bill first. So I appreciate your testimony as always, and that's a sad situation, but you always have such good things
Senator,
to say.
if I may, one important thing about that is mental health is not just a matter of psychosis and diagnosable disease categories that would be listed in the manual and so on. It's often a situational thing where someone is already isolated and feeling a failure, feeling helpless. When James Baldwin used the phrase years ago, the most dangerous person in any society is a man who has nothing left to lose. And what we need to do is find ways of dealing with those persons who feel like they have nothing left to lose before they say, well, at least I can become famous. That's what we have to change.